starting. Is it working?
Yeah. It's coming in the red one.
Wait.
How do you know? We didn't see any feed. Oh, it's coming.
Ah!
Because of the internet.
Huh?
Because of the internet.
Really?
No. It's the setting.
What just happens? I don't know.
That's the setting. You go to account settings. Well, where did you go? Advanced, right?
So can you check in your phone?
That's the thing.
Maybe with other personal YouTube channel that if it's working out, right?
Yeah.
That's why we need Aslan here.
Oh my goodness.
Is it working?
Hold on, let me find it.
Can make you married.
That's the best thing.
Yeah, you should play with it. Suddenly, if you give it to somebody,
Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah.
Can you check the volume and stuff? If I'll be talking? Or Hassan, you can...
yes.
Looks like it's working.
Oh, okay.
Wait, I swear.
Can we use this one?
Oh, Eric, can you speak something?
I'll go out.
Hello. Hello, 1, 2, 3.
I'm going back.
Virginia International University, my texting.
Can you see it?
A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
What? This is the first time we are doing this.
Bro,
Oh, really?
do you have something to read to me? Huh? You cannot hear me? What is the video for? Let me read something. Hello? Hello?
Can you talk, please?
Thank you for visiting the exhibit on VIU's exhibit on African Americans' contribution. Enjoy your tour.
Graduation meeting.
Leaders breaking down barriers, child prodigies, influencers on social policy and academics. Follow the trials of historical landmarks. 1, 2, 3.
The sound is low.
It's low.
Yeah, we can keep it low.
Can you check now?
It's your software. Take the mic.
Ah, yeah, I've just put it up.
No, not there. Mic DV setting should be high.
No, I mean the mic is direct from here.
The sound is really low.
Yeah, I've made it high. You can check it now. The sound goes from this camera.
Actually,
So I have made it.
I can hear you, Saji, but it has to be closer to the speaker.
Oh, because the mic is here. I think now it will be taken. So can you check
Can
it?
you
What is the
talk
software?
from here?
You have the mic setting, right? This is the one?
Yeah.
You know how to set the TV settings?
But still see.
No, see? It is so low.
Can you check it out, you guys?
Hello? Hello?
Hello, hi, how are you? Good to see you.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Hello.
We are starting
Hello.
the live streaming. We're
Okay.
going to start it now.
Okay.
Just go to
Check.
the station.
Hello.
Okay.
I can't hear if you need any help with the software or anything.
Well, I assume my talk will be up there.
You want me to post it on
Yeah,
I
the
can-
slides.
Yeah, you want me to send it to you? Okay. I thought maybe you have a drive, but I'll...
Check.
Oh, no,
Hello.
Please make sure that,
Hello.
it's working.
Check. Hello. Hello.
I'm sorry, I thought that you wanted me to send it to you and you would just pull it
It's
up.
okay, sir. I'll just send it to the desktop.
Okay.
Actually, I'm gonna log in from computer and then I'll pull it up.
Oh, okay.
I think it would be easier to stick.
This is the volume.
Volume is high.
Is there a bus room nearby?
Yes, sir. It's actually, if you go out,
Yeah.
go straight to the door, it will be on the left.
Oh, okay.
It
Thank
will
you.
be straight up, but it will be a little bit on the left.
Okay.
Is it because you put the... Can you not take it out?
Sorry. cool. If you have
How do you extend it?
reduce this. So
I'm able to
That sound like
communicate.
the, you know, something like
so you can
static sound? There is a static sound, right?
I think it's because of the mic setting.
No, I mean because of that one.
I think it's...
This one?
How do I start it?
Or?
Where?
Do you guys need a plate?
Yeah, is it this one?
I don't know if it's
See
connected.
how it works? If it works. Just divide it to lots of ends, please. Thanks.
I see. Over here.
Fine.
That's the clicker in
Thank
case if you need it.
Okay, so this
This one. we-
forward back.
You can try it out.
A little bit down.
Yeah, so
Where do I have
that
to
goes
po-
right.
Where do I have to point it?
Oh, it's
Any
like,
place.
yeah, anyway, it's 360.
This is good.
Oh, this. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So gonna do this for you.
Oh, I got to get mic'd, huh?
Yeah, because you are just recording
Right.
and it's being live streamed.
Where are the students? Where's it being streamed to?
I don't know, like to the online. I'm not sure, like people like.
Where does this fit? There? Does it fit behind here?
Yeah, this one goes behind your ears. It's gonna be easy. And this one goes over here. Yeah, exactly. That's it.
Like that?
Yeah.
Doesn't feel like it's big enough.
You feeling comfortable or? Yeah.
Feels kind of strange, but it's okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
And this just goes in my pocket.
Maybe you can put it inside your pocket. That one. Okay.
Put it inside this pocket.
Yeah, that's cool.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay. How big of an image are you tracking there?
Sorry?
How big is the image there? It gets me and the slides? or-
It's
Right.
you and the other side.
So if I walk over here, it's okay?
Yeah, but this way, like, it's not correct. From there, you can just walk
Okay, but if I go this way, I'm out of image. Okay, okay. Because I'm sure I will come over here and point to things on the slide.
That's fine.
Does this have a pointer?
Yeah.
Ah, okay, maybe I won't have to walk over there.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Hi there.
Hello.
I recognize you from the picture.
No, I
I'm Kevin
didn't.
Martin, assistant in the School of Education.
Glad to meet you, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Oh, glad to be here. This is being live streamed, I guess.
Supposedly, yes.
And where are the people on the other end?
We have a good number of people in Ukraine.
Uh-huh.
I don't recall the other ones off
Okay, but around the world.
Yeah,
I mean,
around
not
the
just in the United
there.
States.
Right.
Oh, okay, good. I actually have an example in my talk from Ukraine.
Good. Do you need water or anything?
Maybe I better. Is there?
I can get you a bottle of water over there back.
Okay, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Do you need anything else?
Nope, I'm good.
There's some coffee.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. We'll wait for another 5 minutes and then we'll start.
Okay.
People come up.
Where is this being live streamed to?
Let's see. Right now, we have, we can ask to introduce themselves so we can find out exactly where they're from. Last time we had 3 viewers from Ukraine.
Really?
Yes, and also locally who couldn't make it to the Virginia Church, so
Okay.
they were just tuning in on the website.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
One of my examples is from Ukraine, so I better be careful.
there you go. Really?
Yeah.
Huh. No, I think, well, you probably know better, but it's beneficial for all of us to learn ongoing problem. I think we'll benefit from.
Well, it goes
sharing.
back to the media campaign back to the Russian conflict
Oh, wow.
and looking at whether the social media was in Ukrainian and Russian or Suzik or
Right.
as you probably know, I don't speak Ukrainian, but 6 different dialects of
True. Yeah.
Suzik,
Yeah.
and so you can look at the dialects to tell where people are really from.
There you go. Yeah, that would be interesting. So learn about it. I mean, even
Yeah.
for Ukrainians living within Ukraine, they are not aware that they could end up they could end up with not being able to communicate with somebody who's from the regional part of Ukraine.
Yeah.
So the western part of Ukraine.
We had a student, this was a couple of summers ago, who her family was, she was in the United States, but her family, she grew up speaking Ukrainian. And so she really got into this and was looking at the different dialects and
Interesting.
the training, and she was a linguistics student.
It's something to definitely to research and I've lived in the western part of Ukraine, which is right on the border with Slovakia, the area. It's called Uzhhorod, and it's Carpathian region. And going from the main city, from the main Carpathian capital of Carpathian region, going to like 30 minutes away, 40 minutes away, into like, oh, I don't understand you, even though I'm speaking Ukrainian, I don't understand because it's completely like upside down. So
That's right, it changes.
it's very
It's quite a bit,
local, yeah. she and her family, they're here from, they're here, I think they're immigrants, but they're from Belarus, for example.
From Russia?
Belarus.
Belarus. Oh, okay.
Four people watching.
So they could give that on the same.
I ran into some people downstairs who are coming. They're just trying to get a little bit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, one of the computer science professors and a political science professor.
Maybe another 2 weeks to go.
I'm at your disposal, whatever.
Precise on the thoughts on the time. It's our group of students.
Okay, now is 4:30 a hard stop? Or
Usually, yeah, it's around 4:30 and
People
plus
get up in
minus
there
5
then,
minutes.
yeah.
It's really doesn't work. So usually it's a question and answer, but then it's 10 minutes until we end the session. But we can, usually there are also people asking questions online. If you don't mind, at the end I'm going to address those questions if there will be any.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. I'll try and leave some time for you.
Thank you.
Since 2004. That's close to the beginning. Because it started in 2003,
Yeah.
in March of 2003.
I remember I actually came to the discovery right around the same time when Castle was just starting. I'm in linguistics, so I was linguistics and language acquisition. So most of the people that I know at Castle are in the
I'm in linguistics, but
language cognition,
Really?
working on the high lab and
oh yes.
that sort of thing. I was excited to see Castle come into existence.
Yes, no, I was too. I mean, it was a long time in Ohio, and when it came into existence, and I thought that looks like a fun place to go to.
So how did you find out about it, actually?
They actually, at that time, it was just getting started, and I'd done some work on translation, interpreting it, edited book on it. And so they came to Ohio to recruit me to develop a white paper on translation, research on translation. So I came in, this was in January of 2004, and I thought, you know, I enjoyed talking to people and meeting people and going concern, and so one big old, next thing I knew, I got hired.
So I mean, from what I've heard, it's a fantastic place for interdisciplinary sharing. Just everyone that I've heard from who works there loves, you know, being able to work with cognitive scientists and linguists and
Computer
neurologists.
scientists and anthropologists and
Right,
neuroscientists
right,
and
right. And
yes.
they do actually work together on the same project.
Oh, yeah, of course.
It's just awesome. It's so cool.
I'm going to, the first few slides here, I'm going to talk a little bit about Castle. Because most people don't know
Yeah. Yeah.
what Castle is. And so.
I think there's an impression that a lot of what goes on at Castle is sort of shrouded in mystery because of non-disclosure agreements.
No, it was a secure environment,
Yeah.
I will mention, but most of the research, well, I'd say 80% of the research is not classified at all. It's completely open. Well, like high lab. That's completely open. That's not
Yeah.
classified.
Yeah. And they do present about it at a bunch of conferences.
Right. And so, you know, what I'm talking about today here, I mean, some of what I talked about here last spring semester, I taught an undergraduate honors course on cyber psychology, which includes this kind of stuff. But that's not, you know, classified. Or if you read the paper, you learn more than what's classified.
final presentation.
Okay.
Alright, so thank you so much again, Dr. Danks, for being here at Regina University, presenting for the Voice from the Field, the Scope of Education. Dr. Danks is a research professor emeritus and formerly technical director for strategic intelligence analysis at the University of Maryland Center for Advanced Study of Language, CASEL. His research has focused on how people comprehend sentences and text, especially across languages, and the cognitive process involved in translation, and how elderly patients communicate their life-sustaining treatment preferences. At CASEL, he has investigated using a cultural lens and social media to forecast the plans and intentions of a country's leadership and populace, and also how to conduct remote psychological assessment of cyber adversaries. Dr. Danks received his PhD from Princeton University and taught for many years at Kent State University, serving as a chair of psychology and as Dean of Arts and Sciences. He also has taught at Princeton, Stanford, University of Warsaw, and Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. Dr. Danks has authored and edited several books and published extensively in psycholinguistics and cognitive psychology. So please welcome Dr. Danks.
Thank you, Victoria. It's very nice to be here and to be able to talk to the people that are here in the room, as well as I understand this is being live streamed elsewhere. In talking with Victoria, she indicated that people might not know too much about what CASEL is, and since CASEL is a fairly unique type of organization in American higher education, I've put in a few slides here at the beginning about CASEL. As you can see, it's a UARC. I'll explain what a UARC is in a minute. For language, information, culture, cognition, behavior, I mean, lots of things. Basically, at any point where there's a human in the loop or interacting with machines or computers or other people, we're interested in what's going on. UARC is a university-affiliated research center, and it blends the expertise in academia with it's a concept of the Department of Defense, and so all of our projects are related to issues with the Department of Defense, as well as the intelligence community. That's why we have the, oops, pressed the wrong button. The Department of Defense here, as well as the Director for National Intelligence. And we do a number of projects in that area. There are 14 UARCs in the United States, and you can see where they're located, major universities. CASEL is the only one of the UARCs that deals with human, social, cognitive, behavioral sciences. All the rest of them are on physics, primarily on physics and engineering. Their languages, like we like to say, their languages are all zeros and ones, and we talk with real language, and so it's a little different. We're our sponsor. We just switched. Our new sponsor is the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and our management is through the Air Force doing the contract. Right now, we have about 30 research or 40 research faculty. To work at CASEL, you have to have a top secret clearance. In the areas that we're covering here, you can see foreign languages, culture, linguistics, cognitive sciences, decision, knowledge sciences, information, computer sciences. So we are really a multidisciplinary center, and in fact, all of our projects, without exception, use researchers from several different disciplines. And so we're not focused on just single discipline projects. Some of our clients, you can see, are throughout the United States government, and we have collaborators in a variety of some other universities, as well as other people in the government, as well as private industry. Some of the mission areas where we've worked
have been in what I call the human capital, developing workforce readiness training, aptitude. Someone mentioned to me about high lab. This is where high lab fits, where we're looking at aptitude. It's to look at high level language aptitude. On the job performance, interventions in terms of strategic analysis, operational effectiveness. We look at teams and how they perform, strategic analysis. And a good bit of what I'm going to be talking about today would fit into in the strategic analysis category. That is where we're using language, culture, cognition to try to understand how people are dealing with various sorts of cyber communications. And then we sometimes do some program evaluations where we look at return on investment and a number of other aspects like that for the federal government. Now to get into my talk today, which is why Victoria asked me to come and talk with you about beyond machines, we're looking at the role of humans in various sorts of cyber operations, whether it's defense, whether it's offense, whether it's espionage, but what is the role of the human in all of this? And this is the critical factor. So oftentimes in cybersecurity, cyber operations, people are very focused on the technology. So for cybersecurity, how can I build a better firewall? How can we use better passwords, et cetera, et cetera. But there's always a human involved on each end of those machines that are making lots of decisions relative to this. Last spring semester, I taught a course an undergraduate honors course at the University of Maryland on cyber psychology. And what we focused on was all the technical reports that were looking at how humans interacted in various sorts of cyber operations. So for example, the first thing I did, this was a year ago January, and the intelligence community report on the Russian hacks of the DNC had just been published. And so the first day of class, I had handed that out to them. Actually, I handed them the link so they could go look it up. And said, come back on the next day of class and be prepared to discuss all of the humans that are involved in this, from Putin on one end to Hillary Clinton on the other, and all the people in between. What roles did they play? What motivations did they have? Were they risk takers? What were they trying to accomplish, etc.? That is, looking at the psychology. And so that's what I'm getting at here, is what we're trying to look at is what is the human in the loop. I want to acknowledge my collaborator, co-author, David. He was at Carnegie Mellon, and yes, he's my son. But some of this came about from some dinner time conversation that we would have when we get together, and so on. We published a few papers together, and I must say it's great fun at this stage of my career being able to publish with my son. If we look at, get an idea, to set the stage here, a comparison of kinetic warfare and cyber warfare, we see that there are quite a few differences, at least in contemporary warfare. In general, with kinetic warfare, the target is identifiable. Okay? They're typically wearing uniforms, or they're with machines with insignia. There have been some instances where, going back to the Vietnam War, where combatants didn't wear uniforms, or they blended in with the populace. And we are, even in the last couple of years, we have heard of cases where warfighters have been instructed to remove insignia from their uniforms and to go into battle. In cyber, the identification of the attacker is certainly not certain. That it's very difficult sometimes to figure out who the attacker is, who's doing the intrusion, who's putting in the malware, and this can be of concern. Collateral damage is obvious to determine in general in a kinetic warfare, where bombs are dropped or rockets go in, etc. But in cyber, you may not know whether there's some collateral Is there something I need to do?
No, yes.
Oh, okay. There may be some collateral damage. So if you go in and use a cyber attack on a power grid, for example, and it takes out the power to a hospital, there could be some real collateral damage there to hospitals and so on. And we saw some of that with a malware attack a couple of years ago that hit, for example, the British healthcare system. In general, there's a longer scale to planning an attack. You have to develop the malware. It has to be put into use and so on. The cyber is short time because you can get a bunch of developers together. They can develop something very quickly. Whereas Connecticut, there's a lot of times more planning of building the physical materials. And the response typically is publicly obvious. Whenever a country fights back against a kinetic attack, it's pretty obvious. In cyber, the U.S. may have made some responses to some of the cyber attacks, but we don't know it. As a matter of fact, it's usually in the interest of security that they can be kept quiet. Now this gets into some very interesting discussions about just war theory, justifications of war, and how may a war be fought justly. I mean, this is something that people have tried to deal with over the centuries. It goes back a very long time. In the Judeo-Christian history, tradition, there's the commandment of thou shalt not kill. Well, how do you justify killing someone in a wartime setting? What's the difference that allows to violate that? And as was pointed out in a discussion that I had recently about Islamic terrorists, that in fact Islam is a people of the book. Muslims are people of the book, and so the Ten Commandments apply to them as well. So it gets to be an interesting philosophical discussion. But then in terms of the three principles basically are discrimination. Who are the legitimate targets? Who can you go after? Normally it's people in uniform, but you know, how does it work in the cyber case? Proportionality, how much force is morally acceptable? For example, if someone shoots a rocket across a border, we typically are not going to drop a nuclear weapon on them. It has to be proportional to the attack. And the responsibility, who takes responsibility for the consequences if things go wrong? So these are the three basic principles of just war theory. Our overall approach is to look at the people-machine interaction. And most analyses of cyber events assume a perfectly rational agent. That is, the people are going to respond in a very rational fashion. It's done planfully, rationally. And if you're familiar with the Tversky and Kahneman research, with different kinds of cognitive biases and so on, what we have learned from Kahneman and Tversky and many other researchers of that ilk is that people typically are not completely logical, rational when they make their decisions. So instead of assuming a homo economus, we assume psychologicus. So let me consider the three criteria involved in just war theory, and I'm going to be bringing in examples from time to time of different cyber attacks and so on that have gone on in the past to sort of look at this. With discrimination, the primary question is how to identify the combatants in cyber conflict. And by the way, an interesting thing that's come up in the past few years, a very gray area, which is gaining its importance, of how do you deal with artificial intelligence. That is, when the intelligence is not a human brain that's running something, but artificial intelligence that is making decisions in a war context. Stop and think about the drones that are being used in the Middle East that are operated by military in Nevada. You know, sort of like, how does this control work, and how does the command and control work with artificial intelligence? I often think of this in terms of one of the examples we use is stop and think about this in terms of the self-driving cars. Self-driving cars, for example, which are becoming more and more popular, and Uber tests them in the streets of Pittsburgh. So when I go to visit my son, I'm very aware of it. That the self-driving cars, how do you establish trust? How do you establish responsibility? Is it the person who owns the car if there's an accident? Is it the developer of the artificial intelligence? Who's responsible for it? Another fuzzy contrast for cyber is attacks and defense oftentimes are very obvious versus cyber espionage. And I'll talk a little bit more about cyber espionage later, but cyber espionage is the exfiltration of information. It's not a matter of getting, doing damage to some machine or doing damage to a person, but pulling out information. And it gets to be, the consequences of that can be a fuzzy problem. In terms of our own case, for example, when the Chinese infiltrated the database at the Office OPM, Office of Personnel Management, and got all the files of people who have security clearances in the United States. They apparently didn't change any in the information in the OPM files, but they collected it. Now, if they use that information to do harm to some people that have clearances, then it becomes a different kind of case. But just in the simple case, it was simple espionage. There are also different cultural differences that turn out here in the Chinese case. Well, in the United States, we make a very clear distinction between private enterprise and public government functions and so on. Those don't mix, and this is part of the problems with having cybersecurity these days, is that, for example, financial institutions and many other institutions don't want to share their data and their problems with the federal government to try to come up with a coordinated solution, because we have this clear division between public and private. In China, the attitude there is that anything that can be done to protect the state is okay. So going after private enterprise, what we would call private enterprise, is fine because it's done in the service of the state. And so there are these cultural differences in organization. So, you need to do something for me?
Yes.
Because the attribution of who's behind the cyber attacks, the attribution of intention gets to be fairly critical from time to time. And I was talking earlier, this is the Ukrainian example, Victoria, where during the Ukrainian conflict with Russia in eastern Ukraine, there was a lot of stuff in addition to the kinetic parts of that conflict. There were lots of initiatives on social media and so on. Were they botnets? Were they troll farms? Were they real people, real folks just doing their thing? And one of the things that you can look at in terms of this, I actually had a student who was fluent in Ukrainian, that we did some linguistic analyses of some of these social media, because you could look at whether it was a Western Russian dialect, whether it was a Eastern Ukrainian dialect, or there's a Shuzhik set of dialects, or actually 6 variants of Shuzhik, which is sort of a blend of Ukrainian and Russian that is used there. And you can actually tell in some of these variants whether the native language of the person was Russian-speaking Shuzhik, or whether the native language was Ukrainian-speaking Shuzhik. You can imagine then trying to sort out the attribution of these social media. The language differences then become very interesting and very important. The hacks on the Sony servers in Los Angeles, where they were going to release the film. There were some linguistic analyses of the English, because the hackers put English language messages, whole sections of text, letters on the server saying don't release the film, arguing with this, et cetera, et cetera. One of the questions that you can do some analyses of is, what is the native language of the person that wrote that English? Words, as you know, if you've looked at cross-language kinds of things, native speakers of Russian write English differently than native speakers of Japanese. Okay, they make different kinds of mistakes or subtle differences in tone and so on. And so some of the analyses that were done of the English that was put on this helped to identify that the hacks were North Korean. There was some have argued that it was Russian, but I think it's pretty clear that it turned out to be North Korean. And then the hacks of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee that I mentioned earlier, I think that became pretty clear that it was the Russians doing it, but whether it was government Russian agents, whether it was private, whether it was could it be attributed to the government or not, and what was the motivation of this? And this is becoming clearer actually since I wrote these slides up. I mean, there's every day almost it seems like there's something more in the news that's being uncovered about those about the Russian attacks on using our social media. And then there was the global ransomware cyber attack of about a year ago that was finally attributed, I think, to North Korea. But it took down the British National Health System and so on. But again, language analyses go into trying to figure out who did it and what's behind it. Then there's the attribution and motivation for the attack, whether it's what are the intentions. And we have to be able to hear to say, as I am a psychologist, so I think about the fundamental attribution error. Fundamental attribution error is that in other people we tend to attribute the motivations to a personality characteristic, a relatively enduring set of tendencies, or in ourselves we tend to attribute things to our immediate context, to the immediate situation. That if we make a mistake, it's not because we're a bad person, it's because circumstances led me to make a mistake. Somebody else, they're a bad person all the time. So we have to take account of some of these kinds of things as we're trying to do this. There was a attack on a DDoS attack on the computers in Estonia going back a ways when they took down a statue of Stalin. This was after the wall came down and the breakup of the former Soviet Union, and everybody sort of assumed, well, was it Russian? It was the Russians must have done that as retribution for taking down the statue of Stalin. But then further analyses, maybe it was some Russian sympathizers within Estonia, and I think the final analysis, based on some of the language, was that it was some Estonians who were Russian sympathizers who were upset with what happened in that situation. And the same thing about the hack of the DNC. This is getting to be old news by this particular point. One of the things that we have to be careful of in terms of this, and where there's easy to make a mistake in these attributions, because remember, we're trying to think like the adversary, trying to think like who might be attacking us, trying to think who might do these kinds of things, is that it's easy to project our own beliefs and perspectives onto what others might be willing to do. And this projection is sometimes difficult to sort out when we start interacting with people and we're trying to make attributions about this. We also tend to project our own current states onto future states. We assume, well, I'm like this today, this is what I believe, this is what I want to have happen. So I'll be the same way next week or sometime into the future. But that's not always true. And there are data to take a trivial example of buying winter coats. The sale of winter coats goes up markedly on a cold day in the stores, but the coats that are sold on those days are also more likely to be returned because they decided, oh, I don't really need that heavy winter coat because there's a cold snap for a couple of days, and so I'm going to take it back. A more critical case, and Victoria mentioned that I'd done some work on elderly patients' choices for life-sustaining medical treatments. I did about 15 years research on that, on Patient Self-Determination Act. One of the intriguing things that we found on that, and I'll simplify it to just a binary choice, that if you give people a choice that, do I want medical treatment of an extreme sort if I'm in a coma and unlikely to wake up, or do I not want? Or if I'm having curable cancer, do I want treatment or not? One of a highly salient example of this is when Jacqueline Kennedy, she developed cancer. I forget the exact type, I think maybe it was pancreatic cancer, but anyway, she developed cancer. And the doctor said, you've got about 6 months to live. She then developed pneumonia, which is often the case with elderly people who are physically infirm. She developed pneumonia, and she said, and she declined treatment. Pneumonia is easily treated. We've got antibiotics that can treat the pneumonia. But she declined treatment for the pneumonia because she said, I would rather die from pneumonia rather than the extremely painful death of the cancer. So that she made a choice as to how she was going to do that. So we looked at this with people and sort of I'll simplify it to a binary choice, either they want treatment or not. 70% of the time, elderly patients, and we interviewed over 300 elderly patients, 65 and over, and also some old, 75 and older. On a two-choice, breaking it down as a two-choice, 70% of the time they change their mind a year later. Okay? So that we don't always know, we can say, and many people say, oh, I know definitely I don't want treatment, or I do want treatment, and so on. A year from now, your circumstances may change and you may or may not. So if we're trying to predict our own future, how are we going to do this with doing attributions to other people in terms of their intentions? Their intentions might change a year from now, or whatever, very easily, and it makes it very difficult to do the attribution of intentions. The second characteristic is proportionality, that if you're defending yourself or you're responding to an attack, it should be proportional. There's a problem with determining what is proportional. Sometimes it's difficult to figure out what is truly proportional based on different sorts of cognitive biases that we have in interpreting things. For example, bringing down an airplane has a very high salience to it, and so that requires an extreme response, but releasing some chemicals that make people sick for over a longer period of time, that has less salience to it, and it's less obvious. That's the availability bias that Kahneman and Tversky talked about. So it becomes also difficult to do prediction failures, that the actual outcome is not necessarily indicative of what you expect. And it also may be that people may vary in what they count as an equivalence in terms of proportionality, and that can have a cultural factor to it. That is, you may have cultural differences in terms of whether something is proportional or not. This is, let me skip this. And the last characteristic is responsibility. That is, identifying who are the non-combatants, what is the collateral damage. One of the examples I use is the fallout from Stuxnet. Have people heard of Stuxnet by now? It was when there was a malware that was inserted into the Iranian centrifuges that made them speed up and go out of control, so that they would go so fast that they would would destroy themselves. There was the problem of attribution. I don't think there's much question in most people's minds now that that malware was developed by the United States and Israel. That in terms of there are lots of fingerprints on it now as people have examined it. Neither the United States or Israel has acknowledged it, that they did it, but it seemed to be that they did it. And there were some very clever things associated with that Stuxnet malware, which involve humans. For one thing, the malware didn't affect 100% of the computers all at once. It'd affect first 5 or 10%, and then it'd go back down, and then it'd affect 20%, and go back down. And, gradually it was sort of on and off and on. And so people couldn't figure out what was going on. Something crazy was going on, but they never saw it as malware that was just blowing the sky off of things. In addition, the malware was set up that it provided information back to the centrifuge operators. The dials that the centrifuge operators were looking at was that everything was operating normally. In other words, it gave false feedback from the centrifuges to the operators. Now think about the human psychological consequences of that. You have to figure it out as to who's doing what. There also was the problem of unintended consequences. Namely, the centrifuges were built by the German company Siemens, but Siemens builds lots of command and control devices that are used around the world. The malware got out and started going after some of the other Siemens control devices, and in some hospitals and some other cases, and caused considerable damage to people in many other countries. It's one of the ways that the malware was discovered is that it leaked out to other devices. So part of this is what we call the chain reaction challenge, that we can't always anticipate what's going to happen down the chain and try to figure out what's going to happen at later times, that there may be triggered some unexpected but automatic responses. I mentioned here, this is an old example, the Dow Jones for the Procter & Gamble stock, and the Knight Capital Group didn't have a stop option. But we saw this recently, just a few weeks ago, when the New York Stock Exchange started going bloop. People agree that most of that downturn was caused by problems with the computer algorithms that do 90% of the trading currently on the New York Stock Exchange. It wasn't the fact that humans were making other decisions, but the computers were seeing some things happen and interpreting correctly or misinterpreting. But anyway, they started making sell decisions, and of course that triggered more sell decisions in the algorithm, so that the chain reaction that we saw in the stock markets is very real. That can happen in any sort of computer network system where things go out of control. I think part of that's what happened with the ransomware attack that hit the British health system, but also other systems around, that got out of control and people didn't realize how far it was going to go. This is because of the combinatorial possibilities of a cyber attack are so great. So let's look here now at if we break down computer operations into computer network defense, and I'll talk about then computer network attacks and computer network exploitation. In general, computer network defense is going to be looking for what are expected to be intentional attacks. The defender is well within his or her rights to try to defend the network, to do the response, but the responses should be proportional to the attack. In other words, they shouldn't be, should try to avoid collateral damage, and this is sometimes difficult to do with a computer network attack. Apparently, this is one of the reasons why Obama did not take stronger actions against the Russians for interfering in our elections in 2016. That it had been established by the intelligence communities that the Russians were interfering with our elections, but they couldn't figure out a good response, one, without letting people know, without letting the Russians know that we'd figured it out, and two, without having all sorts of collateral damage. And so that ended up being a problem. The defender can legitimately try to control their computer network operations. They can do that. It's part of what they're expected to do. But an offensive countermeasure, there has to be a very high ethical bar in terms of the just war theory to pursue that. Computer network attacks are defined as deliberate actions to alter, disrupt, deceive, degrade, or destroy computer systems or networks. This is from the National Academy of Sciences report. One of the interesting things, and this gets into language that's used in policy, is how you do this. If you look at the language for the definition of a cyber attack, there's this definition from the National Academy of Sciences. There's a similar definition from the Department of Defense, from the Pentagon. There's a similar definition put out by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, ODNI, and there's a still different one put out by United States Cyber Command. Okay. All four of those organizations that are involved in one way or another in cyber defense, and I'm trying to identify a cyber attack, have slightly different definitions of what a cyber attack is. And one of the things that we've actually sort of looked at and tried to get into the policy a little bit is trying to look at the language that's involved as to how you define a cyber attack. This one, the National Academy of Sciences report is a good definition, I think, but it's not the only definition that is out there. There's in an attack, you need to look at indirect effects to see what might happen there, if things go wrong, etc. And to try to look at whether there's some bias, in particular if you have an automatic response set up. This gets into the command and control issues that I was talking about with respect to, for example, artificial intelligence. If you have automatic triggers in your network that they're going to respond, not just offensively, but to attack when there's a malware attack come in, then there can be some unintended consequences as to how that plays out in this case. And frequently we cannot always know what those unintended consequences are. Finally, computer network exploitation. This is basically the spy case, where there's access to an adversary's computer network system, but it's to gain an information advantage. There's no attempt to change how the network operates. There's no intent to damage or to cause things, or not even to influence things that come out of that. Figuring out that an intrusion has occurred is often very, very difficult. That is, you can't figure out whether your machine has been accessed or not because there's no damage there. I mean, look at what happened. It's just come out recently. That's why I say much of what I've talked about, you just read the newspaper and you come up with all sorts of examples. That it just came out that the intelligence community said that the voting systems in 7 states had been penetrated by Russian attacks back in 2016.
21.
Huh?
21. The states.
Wasn't
it 21?
There were 21 that were attacked, but only 7 were they successfully penetrated. But only one of the states, Illinois, admitted that had detected and had admitted that they had been penetrated. Yeah, I think it was 20-some that were they tried to get in, but only 7 of them, or at least only 7 of them, that the intelligence community could come up with evidence that that was the case. So sometimes you don't know whether you've been attacked and penetrated or not. So it gets to be a difficult situation to try to figure it out. One of the things that we do at Castle is, we're looking at the type of malware, the type of penetration, the language that's used. Oftentimes there are linguistic cues. And sometimes it's very trivial if you think about humans and how they operate. There have been some defined attacks that only occur between 8 and 5 AM to PM in the country that is suspected of doing the attack. And furthermore, those attacks don't occur on that country's holidays. Well, that turns out to be sort of good evidence that you can do that. But the thing is, you'd think that if someone was trying to do this, that you could get around that pretty easily. You just program your computers to do the attack at a different time. But in fact, that has happened more than once. So the cyber conflict is not about machines. I mean, it is about machines, but it's not only about machines. It's very human-centric. That it's important to try to identify the intentions and justifying responses. And people are human, after all. They make mistakes, they have biases, they have foibles, they don't pay attention sometimes. And so if you're going to understand at a full level cyber conflict, you have to think like humans, like non-rational humans that are going to be making mistakes and biases as they go along. So, thank you. I'll be glad to take questions, and I guess there may be some questions coming in from online. But thank you. Yes.
I have a couple. The first one is non-substantive. Do you have any idea why the U.S. federal government decided to use Kaspersky software? I have always been questioning myself, didn't we have good Microsoft software? What may be the reason for that? So this would be the first one. Did you work on psychological impact of people affected by machines? For example, how would it affect you if your family is killed by, non-humans, by drones? Yes. What would be the effect, the psychological effect on the receiving end? And the other one is a little bit, if you can share what exactly Castle is doing. Are you trying to determine where is the attack coming from, or do you also work on response to the attack?
Okay. Let's see if I can remember those, or maybe I'll go in reverse order.
Kaspersky?
Well, Kaspersky, I've wondered the same thing. I mean, he's well known around the world. His main office is in Moscow. I think Moscow, not St. Petersburg. But anyway, it's, and I sort of wondered, why did the U.S. agencies do that, except it's good. I mean, they thought it was good. More recently, in the last year or so, I've seen things, well, the federal government has now required that no federal agency is permitted to use Kaspersky software because they've decided that it was being used to collect data. So, but to me, it took U.S. agencies too long to figure that out. But anyway, so I don't know otherwise. Second question. Oh, we haven't done anything. I haven't done anything on the psychological impact of people who were attacked, injured by a artificial system. I would think that, I mean, to me, there's a continuum there that would go back to, I mean, the people of England during the Second World War, when they were dropping bombs on London. I mean, they didn't know who their attackers were, except that they were German, and so on. So I'm not sure it makes a huge difference once we've gotten into the mechanized warfare kind of situation. But I haven't studied it, and I haven't looked at that literature. The last case was, yes, Castle is doing some things. We cooperate with various organizations to try to solve the attribution problem. That looks to be something that's important that language can play into. I gave the example of the Ukrainian case. We've done work in some other languages as well. Actually, a study that I'm involved with right now is looking at North and South Korea, and the Koreans are diverging. The languages are diverging slowly, but they're diverging a little bit, so you can begin to see some differences there. How's that going to play out in terms of the relationship between North and South Korea, in terms of the, for example, dealing with weapons of mass destruction, and so, you know, how is that going to play out in that particular case? We've not really done anything with respect to how there would be a counter response. A couple of years ago, David and I and another person did publish an article in Slate, of all places, which advocated or raised the possibility of using chat bots to counteract ISIS. That, for example, if you put out do you know what a chatbot is? Chatbot has AI attached to it, so that you're interacting with the bot, and it's responding like a human, like a normal human in that particular situation. But it's automatic because it's a bot. Okay, but it's a bot that engages in chat. And we suggested that if chatbots were put out there indicating an interest in joining ISIS, is sympathetic with ISIS, and so on, and ISIS is very sophisticated with its cyber operations, by the way. They're very sophisticated in that. But it would keep them busy dealing with these bots rather than real people in terms of recruitment. If they're trying to recruit people who respond positively to their messages, then if they're responding to bots, then they can't respond to real people. It's sort of like a DDoS attack against ISIS in terms of their recruitment operations. But, you know, but that was entirely notional. We haven't done anything like that. It was sort of like we were sitting around having drinks one night and came up with the idea. Yes? Oh. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm one of those binary people, the 0, 1.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I was going to ask you a question, but you talked about chatbot. It's related to that, because in computer science we have what's called a Turing test. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I'm very familiar with it because it's a psychological test. It's not a computer test.
But is it also it's interesting because you added another dimension to it, which is the linguistic part. I was also interested in how you mentioned that you do linguistic analysis to find out what's the nationality of the person.
Mm-hmm.
So you're making basically the Turing test more difficult.
Yes.
So how do you do that? Do you use AI to, do you use machine learning?
We do some machine learning. I mean, we do some straight out linguistic analysis where you have texts in front of us and a person sits there who knows the languages and the different dialects and analyzes them. But we also have done some machine learning in particular of Twitter. We had a project that I directed where we tried to analyze social media in Arabic to determine whether a country was going to experience some social unrest which might lead to political protest and then political disruption and regime change. You know, I mean, the United States intelligence community completely missed Arab Spring. The simplistic analysis of why they missed it is that they were paying attention to the elites. They were not paying attention to the people in the street. So if you start looking at social media, well, you can't begin to look at the billions of tweets, okay? And we were able to develop some classifiers in Arabic that were well, the classifiers were not in Arabic, but they were able to identify tweets that were indicators of social unrest. We had annotators that did a couple thousand tweets as to whether they were the tweets were an indication of social unrest. Then we fed those to the machine, and the machine was able to learn with an F1 of greater than 0.9, which we thought was pretty good, to be able to sort the tweets out. It's sort of one step to begin to look at that. Focused only on tweets. Can you do the same thing with Facebook? Can you do the same thing with pictures, with Instagram, and so on? It gets to be a big problem. But we were successful about doing machine learning with tweets to begin to sort out.
Apparently, that's how the intelligence agencies here figure out that there were maybe some Russian involved in the election, because you start like having people tweeting like supposedly from Illinois small town,
right?
And but the English was
not perfect.
Well, actually, it was like pretty good grammatically, but they didn't use like common idioms.
That's right.
That are used here, so it's
Yeah.
That's not odd.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how they did it. I guess I suppose they used some machine learning to do that.
I'm sure they did some machine learning to look for particular kinds of differences between, thinking carefully about how I say this, to look at some differences between how a native English speaker from the Midwest would say something versus someone who has learned it as a second language, even to a very high level. That there would be very subtle differences. I taught at the University of Warsaw. I have a lot of, I know a tiny bit of Polish, but I edited a lot of papers that my Polish friends had written. And, it was very clear to me that there were certain kinds of things that, I just knew they were going to look out for. I mean, take a trivial example, the reduced use of articles before the noun, because Slavic languages don't tend to use those as much. So, yeah, there are various ways of doing this kind of analysis, but it's not always obvious as to how you do it. I mean, it's hard. To me, it has to start with the human. I mean, one of the things that we did with our classifiers, for example, I will say, it was not based on keywords. We gave a whole tweet, said this whole tweet has something about social unrest in it. This whole tweet has something about social unrest. And the computer was able to learn that. Was able to figure it out. So.
I think it possibly was the recent attack on the Olympic Games, and it came out to be not from North Korea, but by the Russians who wanted to attribute it to North Korea by disrupting the games, the ticket system, and all that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, how did you guys figure out that it was the Russians, not the North Koreans, and you figured it out so quickly?
Were you with the Sony attack?
No.
Oh, this?
No, during the Olympic Games.
I don't know. I wasn't involved with it. But
hopefully not.
But
attacking side.
Yeah, no, but this gets to be an interesting thing. I mean, we haven't done any of this. Disclaimer, but I will say that when we sit around drinking coffee at Castle, we think about, could you design a system that would put out some tweets, for example, that looked like it was coming from China, but is actually coming from some other country. Say, maybe it has a little bit of, or you put something, maybe a better case, you put something out in Uyghur, in Western China, that it's in Uyghur, but you think it came from China. And if the United States could do that, then that could, relations are already bad between the Uyghurs and the Chinese, but, to see whether that might do. Yeah, there are all sorts of interesting things. Can you spoof another person's second language learning? Not just their first language, but can you spoof their second language learning? I think it's possible in theory, but figuring out how to do it is a whole different ballgame. And that's because we have this, the linguists in the room know this full well, is that what we call a language is not a single coherent system. It's a collection of many, many subdialects, and even if you can get about as down to the idiolect level. And so, you know, how do you do it? Victoria was telling me that when she was in Ukraine, you know, somebody 60 miles south, 60 kilometers south, I'll say, 60 kilometers south, you couldn't understand, even though they were both speaking Ukrainian. I mean, there's people, we have this false idea that language is a coherent whole with a regular system. That's the rational economic model. That's not the way humans are. They're doing their own thing when it comes to their language. And the main criterion is, can they communicate or not? And that's what turns out to be important. Yes.
I have a last question, I guess, because we're out of time basically. If you may tell us, what do we do with indigenous languages? Are there any, is there any way to, look at the cybersecurity within the indigenous region and languages that are dying out and those that won't regions? So, is there any chance to secure there?
I don't know. There are a couple of people at Castle that have expertise in indigenous languages and have thought about this far more than I have. I mean, obviously the computerization is working against that. It's working against the indigenous languages. Who knows how it will happen. Other than using, no, I just can't say it. I mean, you can use technology to try to preserve the language and so on. And I know there are many efforts being done to do that. In terms of if there's only a few speakers left, you try to collect as much data as you can. But I don't know of any artificial intelligence system, for example, that could be used to recreate a language that has died out.
So the language is that is as of now, there's no way to bring it up.
Well, we do this with some of the classical languages. I mean, we do follow things, but to make it a viable language again, I don't think. Right now, I'm not familiar with any computer system that would be able to do that.
One more question?
Sure.
Yeah. In the light of the development of machine learning and breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, while Elon Musk has his own views which are very pessimistic versus, for example, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, who's very supporting and investing his resources on this. Do you have a sense of that we can ask you? What is like your views and your opinion? Are you optimistic?
Actually, I'm quite optimistic about it. No, I think as a human-oriented psychologist, I sometimes take offense at the computer scientist appropriation of psychological terms to describe the cognitive processes of artificial intelligence. But on the other hand, I've been quite impressed with it. I mean, I think that AI is going to be important, and I think we have so much to learn about to use military terminology, about the command and control of it. I mean, you start looking at the Internet of Things, it can get a little scary if your whole household is taken over by the Internet, and your shopping list is determined by, your refrigerator can tell whether you have enough butter or you need eggs and you need some milk and so on, and your shopping list is made up through artificial intelligence. I think that's, I think that's probably here, but it's pretty fanciful, but I think it's possible. I think what to me is the big thing, and I'm speaking as a psychologist here, obviously. I mean, I think artificial intelligence is going to continue to develop in but how it is viewed by humans is the big problem. And let's take the example of the self-driving car. When we're out on the road, I drive back to Maryland from here and so on, I don't think there will be a self-driving car on the road. This is not Pittsburgh or Silicon Valley. But, you know, there are people behind the wheel of those other cars, and I have a certain amount of trust in them, a certain amount of expectation that they're not suddenly going to swerve into my lane. It may happen, it does happen, and so on, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a trust in the human operator. How do you build that trust in the artificial intelligence? And you look at the military and the command and control. Military officers don't want to lose control over their weapons. You could build a drone with a considerable amount of artificial intelligence that could go out and make its own decisions. You know, it could be taking pictures, images of the ground, and on its own identify this as a military target, and then take it out. Or a robot, which is a land-based drone, you know, same kinds of things. Well, but with the self-driving cars, how do you build that trust? I mean, as I said, my son lives in Pittsburgh, and you can tell, I don't know if any of you have been to Pittsburgh, you know, but Uber's testing the cars there, and you can tell them quite readily because they got all this apparatus on the top, on the roof of the car. So you know what's a self-driving car. Now, there's always a human in the car, but the car is doing its own. And how do you train and how do you get people to build the trust either to sit in the car and let it drive you or to see it coming down the road at you? And because we make all sorts of very fast decisions. For example, when we're driving around down a residential street and we see a object out in the street in front of us sort of fluttering around or rolling, we do a quick check to see if there's a child over there on the side that's going to dash out in the street and get that. On the other hand, if it's a plastic bag or a plastic cup, we just drive right over it. Okay? Think about the complex decision-making that goes on in that to look at those contingencies. And so you've got to have all that built into your AI system before you can trust it to drive down the street and not hit some kid who runs out in the street after his ball. And so it gets to be some funny complexities there on the human side in terms of using this. I think the humans are going to get, or the computer scientists and computer engineers are going to get far ahead of us in terms of what they're able to design. But I think the big problems are going to be on the human side in terms of how we view these and how we interact with them and operate. And the same thing is true with the military. And I've had some discussions with military. I haven't done any research on it yet. I'd like to. But, you know, that the military has real concerns about the command and control of weapons with artificial intelligence in them. It's a big issue in the military circles because commanders want to have control over their warfighting material. So, okay.
Started, the machine was, I mean, they did a test between humans and computers.
Right.
5 years ago, the computers were able to recognize 50%. They recognized, like, for instance, an animal.
Mm-hmm.
The result were like 50%, and human were 80%.
Right.
5 years later, now the machine has already reached 80%.
Yeah.
And it's going to probably get.
Well, it's going to get better, no question. Yeah.
But the problem is that so far, the machine learning algorithms that we are developing and the data that we feed into them, they are done by humans.
Mm-hmm.
And human, like you said, care, right? So
right.
What happened with the Google self-driving car is that it encounters a case. It was like when it has the accident, and it was like, okay, what's going on here? Because it was a car. There was a car that was parked in the middle of the road. And it was
right.
It's a case that was not input into the machine. So the machine didn't panic, didn't know
Right.
what to do.
Yeah.
So
Well, and
so
you-
that's
but-
going to be the interesting part, is
Yeah.
that when we're going to be reaching the part where actually not the data when we're going to be input not by a human being but the machine.
Mhm. Right. Well, and to build in the exceptions in the specific circumstances. How many of you know what the Pittsburgh left is? In the city of Pittsburgh, I mean, I had never experienced this. The city of Pittsburgh, you're on a one lane each way street coming up, and there's a traffic light. And there's the person facing you who wants to turn left. The Pittsburgh left is that you give way and let that person turn left in front of you. One car. Only one person is allowed to turn left in front of you, but you pause and do that. And let that one person turn so that it doesn't block up the traffic, you know, get freer traffic flow that way. But, you know, that's a particular exception, and it causes problems for visitors to Pittsburgh because they don't always observe it. They don't know the rule, and so they'll want to pull out and so on. But stop and think about all these local exceptions that you've got to build into the AI system. You know, say a self-driving car coming from New York City ain't going to pay attention to the Pittsburgh left when they go through Pittsburgh. And so, you know, so how do you do all of that? To me, it's a fascinating, complex problem that I think I can solve. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you so much again for being with us, and that's a small gift from School of Education with University University.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for your kindness.
Oh,
Thanks
nice.
for your time.
Thank
And hopefully
you.
the drive back is not not a hectic one.
Yeah, I hope not. This is the wrong. I mean, I do come over
I
to
can open it.
over to Virginia frequently enough that for meetings. Ooh, beautiful, lovely. Oh, lovely apple. Oh, I love the glasswork. Thank you.
Has your name on the back.
Wow, fantastic, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
But I come over here often enough that I always try to get my meetings done by 2 o'clock to go back over to Maryland. So I'll be patient and get in line and.
Thank you. I'm the political scientist in the room, so
Okay,
that's
good.
why the questions. But
Good,
this was
good.
so insightful.
Good, well, thank you.
You
Thank
seem
you.
to be doing a great job in the center.
Yeah, we're doing all sorts of interesting stuff, and so that's the fascinating part of it is the interdisciplinary, you know. I mean, there are all these problems out there, and sort of how could you not keep being interested in them? You know, I'm emeritus now, but I can't stay away from the problems. I want to keep working on the problems because they're so fascinating.
Is there somebody who is working on these topics and discussing the ethical perspective? We have a conference coming up on ethics.
Yes?
And it just gave me the idea that the future would be how would this actually be packaged within the ethical constraints and norms that we have, especially in warfare. And I'm thinking it would be great to have somebody who is looking what would be ethical in hybrid warfare, in cyber warfare, where do we put the limits? If there is a new international regime, and I believe that we are talking about a new international infrastructure, if you know somebody who may be...
I have to say, at the risk of being nepotistic, my son is in a department of philosophy.
Oh, he is? Oh.
And that's why you detected a certain ethical flavor to this,
Yes.
dealing with ethical
Yes.
problems. That's from him.
But is he in the region?
He's at Carnegie Mellon.
He's in Pittsburgh.
Yes, and he comes down here frequently.
Oh, he does?
Yeah.
I don't might have my business card, but if you have yours, I would reach out to you. And if he's around here, we would have the first day of the conference on the 31st of April.
Okay, I don't know if he's available. He
would
does a
just
lot of traveling, and so.
send
but
an email and see
okay.
whether he would be interested to speak about this topic.
I have a political science question too for Dr. Diggs, but maybe you also have a perspective on it. So
I'm really intrigued by this idea of sort of philosophical or cultural or psychological incommensurability, where people just are misunderstanding each other, talking past each other.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have any kind of, if you could like talk through a concrete example of when a government or some kind of political
And
actor.
I'm Dr. Bilgin, so
Okay.
I would send a
Okay.
copy on
Yeah,
the email.
copy me on it. My,
Yes,
my
yes.
information's over here.
Great.
So is there a sort of concrete example of when you had a political actor or a government or something that showed projection bias in a way that either created a conflict or exacerbated a conflict? Just an example of that from
Well-
events that have happened in the world. And then if something like that happens, who might be positioned to try to counteract that? And how can you counteract that kind of projection bias?
Well, from political science perspective, we speak about sharp power. Yes, we are
Mhm.
beyond being soft and being hard. Sharp power is exactly this kind of cyber
Mhm.
hybrid warfare. And from the Russian perspective and Eastern European perspective, the justification is, well, we don't have all these weapons, and we are behind in the weapons race. So this kind of allow us to use cyber international intelligence to compensate. It's almost like a terrorism. We have an imbalance, and information intelligence, at least in my part of the world, Eastern Europe, is justified by saying, because of this imbalance in weapons and power, we rectify it by using AI. Is this what
Right, I
you
can't, I understand what you're saying. I can't think of a good example right now.
I want an example of where the way that you think, you project the way that you think on how someone else is thinking, and you attribute motives to them and intentions to them that they didn't actually have.
Right.
And then because of this assumption, a wrongful assumption, you actually create a conflict when a conflict didn't need to exist.
happens all the time?
Yeah, that's where I want
happens.
examples of
But
that.
she wants
I
a good
feel like it
example.
must- yeah, what you say.
Well, if you, I mean, just the biggest would be listening to RT, yes, and the Russians would say, the Americans want to do that, or from outside America is always a big monolith that is vying for power, and I'm like, no, they're different
not what they're
departments. There is a confrontation, and because these are authoritarian regimes where always things are decided by one person or a small group of people, they always perceive that American foreign policy is like this. There is never a perception that the State Department or the Pentagon can be on different pages. And outcomes may be
okay, that
actually
there can be checks and
Yes,
balances.
it is always that America is one person, in a very hierarchical way does that.
So people with that mentality must be extra scared of Trump then.
Yes.
Yes,
yes,
because they say
with good reason.
Yeah, yeah. There is no
Well,
checks, there are no balances, nothing can be done.
What he says is what's going to
Yeah. I think one of the things you're talking about mirroring, I think the United States, I'm sure sophisticated intelligence people have not, but we tend to misattribute why Iranians want the bomb. I don't think it's because they want to go bomb Israel. They don't want to bomb Sunni Saudi Arabia. They don't want to bomb in Syria. Rather, it's a seen as a type, but that's the way the Americans think, very instrumental. What are you going to use it for? It has to have a utilitarian purpose, otherwise why would you build it?
In a way, maybe just to be safe, they kind of have to think that way, even though it could be counterproductive.
Yeah, right. But I think that, there's some evidence, and I'm not an Iranian expert, I was in a discussion earlier this week about some of this, but that they may need it as a way of national pride and even Shia pride. You know about Shia Sunni?
Sure.
Okay, because Saudi Arabia has 2 of the 3 holy places, the other one's in Israel, 2 of the 3 holy places. The Iran Shia doesn't have any holy place. So if they want to be seen as a leader of the Islamic world, they need to have power. Okay? Not that they're going to use it, but that's the kind of thinking that goes on because, in the United States, we would just simply say, well, they want it because they're going to use it. But
or
it
like
may be.
What can give us distinctive status?
Yeah, exactly.
Or internal legitimacy for the regime.
Yeah.
Like today's, yesterday's speech on new weapons by Putin. Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Here, everybody, I'm sure in Washington D.C. would be freaking out. And when I look at it, I'm like, well, this was an election speech. That was what it was.
Right.
It wasn't like, yes, we are starting a nuclear arms race. This is like, this is what I would be campaigning on.
Right.
So it depends how you look at it. If,
I mean,
if you're in the Pentagon, you're like, oh.
I mean, it's like Trump saying, I'm going to build a wall with Mexico, and Mexicans are going to pay for it.
Yes.
It's a campaign slogan. I'm going to repeal Obamacare. Campaign slogan.
But I think that from a political science perspective, the biggest question is, if we have AI intelligence weapons, yes, and artificial soldiers, whether we would be able to control them and create an international regime for control, like with the nuclear weapons and the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
Because for me, this is the new atomic bomb. That's where we are going.
Gosh, I haven't thought
It
about
moves
that,
us to a totally different type of warfare, which we may decide to restrict or not. But I'm not sure whether we can do that the way we did it with atomic and nuclear weapons.
Well, I mean, you're familiar with the Tallinn Accords? Oh, there's the Geneva Convention for Kinetic War.
Okay.
There's actually, it's version 2.0 now with Tallinn. The
Tallinn. Okay. Sorry.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Right. Okay. On basically doing rules of warfare in the cyber area, where countries got together and voluntarily, and it was primarily an academic exercise. It was not governments, but the academic exercise to try to put rules of warfare around cyber. And they've come up with some.
And there is always this problem of cheating, yes?
Yep.
That if I restrain myself in research and development, but you don't, and I'm within disagreement, then what happens? The prisoner's dilemma being